Yeah, good. We're getting there.
All right, well, my computer will not start my video camera, which is super unfortunate. I think last time I had to like uninstall and reinstall all my camera supporting stuff. So, all right.
You should be able to still see if you share your screen, Prof. Diaz. So, not perfect, but yeah.
Yeah, it just, some people need to see.
We won't get to see your gesticulations, but
Yeah. All right.
you tell me how to wave my hands, I can do it.
More enthusiasm, jazz hands.
That's right. That's right. Total domination.
All right. Well, sorry for that delay, everyone. Let's see. All right. Share screen. We're good. Share computer sound. All right. Recording. Great. Cool. All right, everyone. So we're going to continue. Quick note. So someone emailed me, made a very good point. I just realized something. So right now it says that our quiz is on Wednesday, but we also won't be finished with the unit on Wednesday since we're doing a synthesis day on Wednesday. I figured it makes more sense to just have the quiz on Friday. I'm going to be moving it from Wednesday to Friday. I'm still going to keep I'm still going to have obviously office hours and a review session tomorrow because the synthesis day is going to be review, not really, and not really going to be adding too much. So we can still have the review session. The review, the study guide of, the cut down concept questions for the quiz are on Moodle. So please check those out. Make sure that you look over them. Again, review session tomorrow, and then synthesis day on Wednesday, and then quiz on Friday. Any questions about that? So saying, let's see, the Unit 6 quiz, we would have a quiz and the module exam back to back. Yes. Unfortunately so. Yeah. Yeah, we'll give you stuff on that. For the final, it's going to be, module. It's going to be just my module. So, review those 4 quizzes and we'll have that information. I'm not going to, obviously there's concepts that overlap both modules, but it'll be primarily on the stuff that I've taught. So we won't hopefully have to go too far back for that. Yeah. Cool. All right. So today what we're talking about is the role of disturbance. So what we're going to be talking about is how changes in environment, how changes to ecosystems, things such as, forest fires and human intervention, how they affect species and biodiversity and distribution. But mostly talking about the fact that they're very important for stability of ecosystems. You may think of forest fires and changing environmental conditions to be a purely negative thing, but we're gonna have to, we're gonna go past that and realize that disturbance is actually important for those different aspects. Let's see, recapture questions. I definitely won't grade them by 10 a.m. So sure, you can turn them in by midnight. That's fine with me. As long as by the time I'm looking at them, it's on the stack, then that's fine. Once again, this is not about giving you heavy deadlines and forcing you to follow those. We want you to learn, right? So concept questions are us, just trying to give you a little bit more incentive in order to work on that. For the recapture, if you can post it as a PDF or you can put your information in the comments, I'm fine with that. Moodle does a decent job of letting you annotate PDFs and look over them. So as long as it's in one of those two forms, I'm fine with that. Don't upload a Word document because that often does not come in with the appropriate stuff. And sometimes it literally deletes things that you write and moves things. So just upload it as a PDF or comments like you did in the past for Professor Aiden's recapture. All right. So, role of disturbance. What role does disturbance play in environments and for species? Yes, definitely. If you didn't do the other recaptures, please do them. Always more points for you. So, ecological disturbance, first foremost, we're going to define that. And so it's some force or event. And so again, these can be non-biological, biological, abiotic, biotic in origins. But they bring about mortality of organisms and changing, and this is the big one, changing in their spatial patterning in the ecosystem, right? So changing how an ecosystem functions, the different hiding spaces for organisms, availability of resources. Ecological disturbances can wipe out entire species, or they can cull and force species into smaller environments. But either way, we have these issues. The reason it's really vague is because it can be many different things, and what is an ecological disturbance in one environment may not necessarily be as big of a disturbance in another, right? Creatures are more or less adaptable to environments, and certain environments, as we talked about, are dynamic in themselves, right? The moving of tides is an ecological disturbance, even though it's a changing in spatial patterning. But these come in a lot of different ways, just like biodiversity, just like genetic change. There's all these different things that can affect it. So we have environmental change. So changes in temperature, changes in climate, wind patterns can have a big effect on distribution of species. Say, you have more wind, and so all of a sudden trees have to, increase their secondary growth in order to be able to survive in it. And you have changes of that. And those, if you have more wind, smaller trees are going to break and not be able to survive, So you have environmental changes. You have a huge one, which is human interaction, which comes in a lot of ways. There's logging, there's destruction of habitats, there's recreation of habitats, which we do. Not everything humans do are negative. We have conservation and things like that, where we're trying to reinstill environments. So we can have changes in environments, obviously, in habitat, and then you can have toxification, such as, a change in the chemical composition of the land. Say when, the Romans used to salt the earth and burn down people's crops and then salt the earth, right? Adding a new type of thing such as salt or a new chemical that an organism needs to deal with will change what is, adaptable in that environment. And then we have introduced species or invasive species, depending on which version of the textbook you have, which can obviously change environmental niches. And so that's, I guess, the biggest part of these disturbances is all of these things are different ways in which you can affect the niche of an organism or an entire ecosystem, how you affect that, those trophic levels and that food web. In extreme cases, you can have, widespread disease, such as, the disease that's helping kill ash trees, the fungus, or there's, in a lot of cases, there's a fungus. Personally, you might know what it is, but it affects amphibians. It actually grows on them and then blocks them from being able to breathe with their skin, so they actually suffocate. So disease, if it's widespread amongst a population or an area, can also change all of these things. Ranavirus, yes, I think that's it. That sounds familiar. And then obviously natural disasters. So, massive topography changing, tsunamis and typhoons and forest fires and things like that. And so they bring down organisms that held an important niche. Exactly. Yes, that is exactly what I was talking about. Them frustrating because yes, I was thinking about the frogs on the preserve. Thank you. Yes. All right. Oh, that makes sense. And so in all of these cases, this ecological disturbance causes some type of organism to either die or be shifted out of its ecological niche. And so this can be both positive or negative for biodiversity, depending on how widespread and often it is. Right. And so, it's very complicated. It can be very complicated and depends greatly on the environment. Um, and so what we're talking about is this idea is that what is known as the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So when you think about an environment, when you think about disturbance or things of that nature, you might think it looks something like this, right? You have not a lot of disturbance. You have a pristine ecosystem. Everything is beautiful. You have all these organisms living in their environments with their food webs, like perfect. And then you add disturbance. You start destroying the trees and cutting things down. And so you would imagine that as you destroy things, as you have more disturbance, the diversity will drop, right? These organisms have a constantly changing environment. They can't survive. But that's actually not true. I had to draw this curve myself because it doesn't exist. I had to make it because that's not what it looks like. Because relationships between organisms are far more complicated than that. If you remember that video I showed you at the end of last class on those feedback loops, every organism is affecting each other. And so it's very hard to predict what's exactly going to happen. And so it's not always negative. So when you look at an environment, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis looks a lot more like this. When you have very low frequency of disturbance, you actually have really low biodiversity generally. And I'll go over why that happens in a second. And then when you have high disturbance, you also have a decrease. And so this makes sense, right? High disturbance, constantly changing environments, only certain organisms will be able to survive in it. This one makes sense. But why is low disturbance something that is also a problem? Well, if you have low disturbance, you're going to have nothing but natural selection and who is more adapted for the environment. Competition is going to play the largest role in that environment. And so usually, if there's no disturbance, eventually one species in each niche is going to dominate. And so they're going to push out those other species, they're going to die out, and we're going to have low diversity. And so in order to have the highest amount of diversity between species, you need this constantly changing environment. So creatures can adapt, so they can fill new roles, and so they can switch back and forth. And so this is from your textbook. And so, as I said before, at low disturbances, competition exclusively reduces diversity. Again, if you are sharing resources, if you're fighting for it, whoever's having the most babies and allocating those resources so they survive the most is gonna be the best. When you have high disturbances, diversity declines as mortality rises. If you have forest fires constantly, things are going to die. Things are going to be destroyed. Organisms that are living off particular resources, their niche is going to be destroyed. And so at these intermediate levels, you have a balance between this competition that's keeping species constantly changing, that natural selection, and then mortality, which is, destroying some species in its process. And so, it predicts maximum levels of biodiversity should be observed under disturbances because few species are able to tolerate very intense disturbances. Again, homeostasis. If you're constantly changing, it's going to be hard for you to do that. And then few species are able to successfully compete in an environment. And so, new species generally that are going to be evolving are going to be ones that can tolerate these disturbances that are occurring in the environment. So they're going to be shifted that way. Think about a forest fire, right? Australia was on fire for months. What'll happen after all of that settles? You have those plants that died, they're now being returned to the earth. What's the first thing that's going to happen? weeds are going to start popping up. Things that don't care about those conditions are going to start popping up. They're going to start spreading, and so you're actually going to have this change, this changing environment. And so these species need to compete with one another, and so there's going to be what is known as environmental succession, or this process in which environments that have been destroyed slowly build up and biodiversity starts to spread. But as you have these disturbances, species need to compete, which leads to evolution of new species that then fill the old niches. And, if you create a brand new niche, then you are creating a new part of that food chain, a new feedback loop. And so this is, again, that idea of adaptive radiations, that as you have old organisms be removed from an environment, new ones have to fill that space. They will change physically in order to survive in that environment, and new species will start to be propagated and evolve. And so there's another graph that I drew, and clearly it popped up before everything else. And so, disruption of competition, right? The intermediate disturbance hypothesis. What can happen in an ecosystem that does this, that will change levels of competition? Well, first, you could have removal of species, right? If you have these high disturbances such as disease, migration, or predation, bring in so for instance, in our example of the cane toad, right? The cane toad was brought in, it was, migrated in. I'm doing air quotes and no one can even see me. Sorry. So they are brought in, right? They have some invasive species. And so they start eating other organisms, right? Our hope was that the cane toad would eat all the cane beetles, and that predation would remove a species from the environment in hopefully a positive way. But, unfortunately, that's not always good, right? And so it didn't work out in that way. But, you could also have a changing ecosystem because of access to new resources, right? It's not always bad. It's not always fighting over resources that are very limited. So for instance, let's say the rising sea levels, generally considered to be a bad thing, mostly is, depending on for our lifestyle at least. But these rising sea levels can actually create new rivers. They can create, new access to water in environments that didn't have them before. So that disturbance of that changing ecosystem might actually be allowing new resources into environment. And so now organisms don't have to fight over water as much. Perhaps they can have a little bit more diversity in what organisms are competing for that water because it's more readily available. Or something simple as, death of really large trees can land and stay in a canopy. If you have a giant tree that goes down, they live dozens, if not hundreds of years, goes down, it dies, it starts biodegrading, it's broken down by decomposers, and all of a sudden, you're releasing brand new nutrients into the environment. There are now nutrients that are on the floor that weren't there before, that small plants such as weeds can start to grow up. And so what I want you to know is that, over time, biodiversity is in constant flux. And so, yes, it's important that we pay attention to biodiversity, but there is, some leeway in how many species exist on the world in an environment. And it's always going to go up and down. And, positively or negatively, depending on these different aspects. And so a species niche is the sum of all of the biotic and abiotic resources in its environment and what it utilizes, right? So we have this idea of a fundamental niche, which is the niche that an organism we believe holds in an environment. You have the realized niche, which is a niche that an organism actually has in an environment. And so the difference between these is that, for instance, an organism might, if you look at this on this side, right, we have these two types of barnacles or clams that are living on this environment. This organism that's living at high tide has the fundamental ability to live all along this rock. if you look at this part at the bottom, this organism is able to live in the water, and on top, it's acclimated to the dynamic environment. And so that's its fundamental niche. That's what it can potentially do in an environment. Its realized niche is, though, in this environment, it's not alone. There's actually another species that it's competing with. And so its realized niche is actually up here, right? It's only living up here. It's only able to exist up here because it's being outcompeted over here. And then, and so in this case, this is what's known as competitive exclusion, right? So as we said before, organisms can live in, organisms that are well adapted to their environment may not be able to realize or be able to fully survive in that environment if they have to compete with competition. So for instance, this blue species is just much better at surviving closer to the water. It outcompetes. Maybe it's better at allocating resources, not sure, but it does that. But if you were to remove that species, now all of a sudden this organism can take up this entire area. It's no longer having to fight for that space. And then there's this idea of resource partitioning, right? So two organisms that can be almost exactly the same could have different niches just because they exist on different substrates, right? So, for instance, this organism here, this lizard, is living primarily on tree branches, whereas this other one is living primarily on leaves. These are both lizards who have very similar metabolic processes. Different metabolic processes and living in the same environment, but they're choosing to use their resources differently, right? This one is living, and sitting on sunny surfaces, absorbing sunlight, eating things on these, maybe even eating some plant matter. Whereas this other one is going to hide in shady branches. It's going to eat more insects, and it's not going to be living on this different foliage, right? So species like to differentiate themselves in this way. This happens with spiders all the time. Spiders that look almost exactly the same. You can have like 5 different types of wolf spiders that are in your garage, but they might be living in subtly different, microenvironments, right? One likes to live on the ground. One likes to live higher up. One makes a burrow that's against walls, where one likes to make burrows that are more flattened on the ground, right? You can have very different, allocation of resources in the same environment. And so these two species would not be competing with each other, right? They're not sharing the same space. And so they're able to live and thrive, and that's an increase in biodiversity. So there are a lot of different ways of these, a lot of different things that can lead to biodiversity, right? So for instance, I'm going to show you a video on the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion, which also led to the Cambrian radiation, was one of the most massive extinctions on the Earth, which then led to massive increase in biodiversity. And so it was it's again, biodiversity is constantly changing. It was a huge dip due to oxygen being into the environment. So all of these organisms that didn't deal with oxygen before are now being exposed to it, and they're gonna die. Now, all of those organisms that are gone, there's all of this space for other organisms to develop and start eating, other things. And so it was mass extinction leading to mass speciation. Oh, I forgot that I had to restart. So, 1 second, sorry. Pull up this video.
Let's make lots of money. Drivers who switched to Allstate saved over $700.
So they were basically being suffocated by their own waste. Which, when I say it out loud, that's gotta be a terrible way to go. We don't know the full extent of the damage, but the effects of this whole episode, sometimes called the oxygen catastrophe, is considered one of the biggest extinction events in history. But you know how this movie ends, right? By the time the Huronian glacial period ended about 2.1 billion years ago, some life remained, and the life forms that survived inherited a better, more hospitable planet. Oxygen was now abundant in the air and water, and a new thing also appeared in the atmosphere, an ozone layer. This coating of molecular oxygen helped block dangerous ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and suddenly new things became possible. From there, well, you know what happens. Life became more complex and awesome and wonderful, and here we are. It seems strange that bacteria could end up covering the whole world in ice. And who'd have thought oxygen would be responsible for wiping out almost everybody? But it just goes to show you that sometimes things gotta get worse before they get better.
I think that was a little further than I wanted it to be. Sorry.
Or maybe even a kind of purple microbe known as halobacteria. Either way, they use the sun's energy to convert CO2 and water into food, releasing oxygen as waste. Which was okay for a while, but not for long. Because when these little microbes started farting out oxygen, it changed the chemical balance of the entire biosphere and eventually altered the face of our planet. First, within about 200 million years, the oxygen from these new bacteria began reacting with the iron in the oceans. This turned the ocean from a mellow green to a deep blood red as the seas began to fill with iron oxide, what we know as rust. In fact, you can still see exactly when and where this happened in strata known as banded iron formations, where huge swaths of rust settled out of the oceans to form layers of red-brown rock. But beyond making the water rusty, rising oxygen levels also shifted the balance of power among living things. Anaerobic microbes started to die off, as they were basically poisoned by the oxygen. Meanwhile, the newer, more efficient photosynthetic life began to spread. And things changed even more when the oxygen in the ocean left the water and entered the air. For the first time in Earth's history, large amounts of free oxygen started building up in the atmosphere. And this is what scientists call a game changer. Because then the climate started to change too. Drastically. As the photosynthetic bacteria kept spreading, they used up more and more of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas, so as its levels went down, so did the temperature. On top of that, oxygen also started reacting with the methane in the atmosphere, taking it out of circulation. With greenhouse gases at an all-time low, our planet started to see the first major ice ages in its history. Temperatures dropped so drastically that it triggered a global glaciation, and our once balmy water world became shrouded in ice. There may have been several pulses of these icy events, but by far the biggest of them came to be known as the Huronian glaciation.
Right, so we have these organisms that are starting to change the environment. We have this drastic change in temperature that's occurring. And so it's leading to the death of all of these different species, right? When we talked about oxygen, right? Oxygen can poison things. Oxygen stops respiration and can affect photosynthesis. And so it completely changed the environment. And eventually, biodiversity fell greatly, but then eventually it went back up once we had all of these new, more plentiful resources. Now that we had an ozone layer and things weren't getting killed by UV radiation and things like that. And so when an environment breaks down, there is a pattern to which it comes back, right? As we said, plants are the basis for what an ecosystem can hold. And so it starts with plants and it starts with microbes. And so there are two different types of ecological succession that we'll talk about really quickly. And ecological succession, again, is the process by which the structure of biological communities evolves and builds up over time. And so there are two types. There's primary and secondary succession. In primary succession, you have a new area that has little or no soil. So for instance, when you have a volcano erupt, you have this lava, this molten lava, this earth that's coming up, melting, and then flowing out. You then have it creating brand new ground. As these volcanoes erupt, that's how Hawaii was made, right? You had all of these islands that are being created, and that new island does not have soil and it doesn't have organisms on it, right? Or Perhaps it does have organisms on a different part of the island, but that new land doesn't have any of those necessary components for life, right? And so what happens is that slowly through erosion and movement, you have changes in nitrogen content in the soil. You have slowly but surely, you have this land building up and you have dirt settling on it with which plants can then survive, right? Plants can start to put in their roots and start to grow. And so what happens is you have soil that starts to settle either by, being blown over from another region or by the breakdown of this molten ground. You have soil that's being created, something that can, hold life, hold nutrients. And so after that soil settles, you have pioneer plants, which can be those weeds. You could have those smaller plants that are good at dealing with very inhospitable environments or dealing with low nutrient supplies. Again, dandelions everywhere. Imagine those growing up. They're going to start to take nutrients from the ground. They're going to start forming relationships with any fungi or bacteria that are there. And so they're going to start creating a community. And if you remember from these feedback loops, right, as those pioneer organisms start to die, they will then be adding more nutrients back to the soil after they decompose. And so you have pioneer plants, which are going to exist. Then you have secondary plants that are coming in. Those are going to be creating and dying. And think about it as, as these plants start to die, they're going to create, soil. They in themselves are going to become part of the earth as they break down. And so those will be able to create more and more hospitable environments for other plants. And so you might have secondary plants that are starting to grow. And then, now that there are plants, you can start having herbivores. Herbivores will lead to omnivores and carnivores. And then as you have this ground being settled, you start having larger and larger trees, which are able to cement themselves. Because if you think about it, if you have very loose soil or very low soil, how is a tree supposed to grow? How is it supposed to anchor itself into the ground if it can't possibly dig into it in any reasonable way? Or if that ground doesn't have the appropriate nutrients to sustain such a large organism? And so, so that's primary succession. Again, the buildup from nothing. What you'll see most of the time is going to be what is known as secondary succession, which is an environment that has been destroyed, usually due to some type of human intervention or some type of ecological event, such as a forest fire. And so you have, say, fires that occur, California, Australia, those environments break down, those trees are destroyed, they return to the earth, they start getting decomposed, and then you have annual plants and small plants that start to grow in. In secondary succession, these organisms can come from a long way, right? You can have, say, a deer that's running out of a different part of the forest that's dropping pollen and seeds and other things onto the land. And so you have, pioneer species, which take 1 to 2 years, 3 to 4 years. And then you have your intermediate species, which again are these building up of larger, less capable of dealing with ecological change and need more specific environments in trees and shrubs. And then eventually you have it become an actual community. And so one thing that's really cool is that if you actually go to the Vassar Farm or the preserve and look at some of the different areas, if you actually walk past the rugby field, down the dirt road that you can drive on, you'll see different plots on the left that have all these signs and these big sticks in them. And so Vassar actually has an area where we do experiments on this type of succession. So for instance, one area is mowed every year. Another area is mowed every 3 years. And so you can actually see the buildup over time of these different areas. And they're actually directly next to each other. So you can see different species. You can see different species of plant as well as different species of insects, which are living in the different subsections of just this area on the preserve. And that's because of disturbance, right? In that case, we are mowing and we are destroying any of these larger organisms and their ability to survive, right? We're cutting down trees, we're not dealing with those. And so we have these secluded areas where we can actually watch this succession occur. And so this is the pattern that occurs, right? During primary succession. It's the same in secondary succession, except primary succession is much slower, right? You're going to have, you're starting at a less of a base, right? There's no soil, right? So that has to begin. And so they can take much longer. But either way, there are establishment of a previously inhabited area. And again, the soil plays an important role in this. And we'll talk about later in another lecture how soil specifically provides nutrients and exactly its makeup and how it's broken down. Let's see. I have a video on ecological succession you can watch. I'm going to skip over it for now just because we only have 10 minutes left in class because of my little computer snafu. But you can watch that. And so one thing is that, species are species and how they interact are all hypotheses, right? It's really difficult in order for us to analyze this, and we need to, do experiments on it. So there's one idea called the species area hypothesis, which is something that we've noticed in environments. And it's that larger areas generally hold more species. And so there are a lot of questions about this. Is this because of niche space? So if you have a larger environment, you have more likely for species to have their own specialized area they can stay in, or does that have to do with competition, right? You have a larger space, so organisms are not necessarily coming into environment or having to fight for those resources. Or perhaps are bigger populations more resistant to disturbances? And so there are different hypotheses, and they actually each one is more or less true depending on your environment, right? There are larger areas that have less nutrition, right? And so there's two different ways that scientists can look at it. There's this random placement hypothesis, which is that, there's a larger area, and so that means there's higher amounts of individuals, and thus there's going to be a higher species just innately. And so it's the fact that all these organisms are randomly placed and they're all in their different own mini environments based on it. And so they're going to change over time, become new species. But there's also this idea of habitat diversity, right? So a larger island or a larger area is going to provide more habitats and theoretically more diversity in those habitats, which allows species to also evolve into different ways, overcome these issues and then promote more species. And so depending on the environment and the relationship of organisms, one or more of these may be more or less true. But it's going to, again, like biodiversity, like disturbance in itself, it's all going to vary greatly depending on the specific interactions of species, right? Again, in Australia, you have very little predators. So the marsupials are able to have crazy, silly, and, things such as, koalas live in trees for their entire lives and eat eucalyptus and are high off of this low nutrient food for like 22 hours a day and then are just sleeping the other time, right? They're able to have these very crazy, more specific niches that are completely unadvantageous than it would be in another environment. And so that has to do with both random placement of species, but also the diversity of that environment. And so many hypotheses which explain a common phenomenon. And so depending on the environment, it could be a bit of all. And so the problem with no disturbances is that competition drives extinction of species, right? And so the problem is that even though organisms are going to be in different times, different spaces, as we said, they're going to, live in different areas of the canopy, there's still going to be a problem with overlap of niches. It's just going to happen. Organisms are going to, those lizards I showed you are probably eating similar types of insects, even if they're in slightly different environments. And so less biodiversity leads to easier ecosystem collapse. And so when you have competition driving all of these species, if there's an overlap in their niche, these organisms are going to have to fight for things. But the problem is if you don't have biodiversity, it's a lot easier. If you have less of those feedback loops, you're not going to have nearly as many redundancies in those in that food web, right? If you only have one type of insect, say a mosquito, that is the food source for everything else in the environment, if something happens to the mosquito population, all of a sudden everything else is going to collapse, right? You're more likely to have a keystone species when you have less and less organisms in an environment. And so, having more biodiversity creates more species links, and by being there allows for there to be more innate biodiversity. So biodiversity breeds biodiversity. If you have more predators, you're going to have more prey. If you have more diverse prey, you're going to have different predators, which are going to be feeding on those diverse prey. And so, again, there are two different videos here. So we have importance of biodiversity, which I will show you. And then there's just an example of, for instance, ash trees. Nope, ash from Pokemon. All right, ash trees, which are undergoing, not extinction necessarily because they're all over the world, but there are certain areas are undergoing mass death. Why? Because they have fungus and they have a pathogen that's actually affecting these trees. And as we said before, right, these trees are not going to respond novelly to this new pathogen. They're responding their old way, but this pathogen is going through the trees, it's spreading from tree to tree, and it's actually causing them all to die. And so the problem is that, again, there's no genetic diversity. None of these, the majority of these trees don't have any way of fighting off this brand new pathogen. And so for the last thing we'll do today, show a quick video on importance of biodiversity. No. Come on. I'm having so many computer problems today.
Get ready to break free from the feet. No more sky-high monthly bills or
subscriptions. Tubi has it all.
Nice.
Free. Tubi. Download the app and start watching for free.
I do not promote or support Tubi. They do not pay for this program.
Our planet's diverse, thriving ecosystems may seem like permanent fixtures, but they're actually vulnerable to collapse. Jungles can become deserts, and reefs can become lifeless rocks, even without cataclysmic events like volcanoes and asteroids. What makes one ecosystem strong and another weak in the face of change? The answer, to a large extent, is biodiversity. Biodiversity is built out of three intertwined features: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. The more intertwining there is between these features, the denser and more resilient the weave becomes. Take the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth due to its complex ecosystems, huge mix of species, and the genetic variety within those species. Here are tangled liana vines, which crawl up from the forest floor to the canopy, intertwining with treetops and growing thick wooded stems that support these towering trees. Helped along by the vines, trees provide the seeds, fruits, and leaves to herbivores such as the tapir and the agouti, which disperse their seeds throughout the forest so they can grow. Leftovers are consumed by the millions of insects that decompose and recycle nutrients to create rich soil. The rainforest is a huge system filled with many smaller systems like this, each packed with interconnected species. Every link provides stability to the next, strengthening biodiversity's weave. That weave is further reinforced by the genetic diversity within individual species, which allows them to cope with changes. Species that lack genetic diversity due to isolation or low population numbers are much more vulnerable to fluctuations caused by climate change, disease, or habitat fragmentation. Whenever a species disappears because of its weakened gene pool, a knot is untied and parts of the net disintegrate. So, what if we were to remove one species from the rainforest? Would the system fall apart? Probably not. The volume of species, their genetic diversity, and the complexity of the ecosystems form such rich biodiversity in this forest that one species gap in the weave won't cause it to unravel. The forest can stay resilient and recover from change. But that's not true in every case. In some environments, taking away just one important component can undermine the entire system. Take coral reefs, for instance. Many organisms in a reef are dependent on the coral. It provides key microhabitats, shelter, and breeding grounds for thousands of species of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. Corals also form interdependent relationships with fungi and bacteria. The coral itself is a loom that allows the tangled net of biodiversity to be woven. That makes coral a keystone organism, one that many others depend on for their survival. So what happens when destructive fishing practices, pollution, and ocean acidification weaken coral or even kill it altogether? Exactly what you might think. The loss of this keystone species leaves its dependents at a loss too, threatening the entire fabric of the reef. Ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity together form the complex tangled weave of biodiversity that is vital for the survival of organisms on Earth.
And so, talking about this, right? They're talking about corals, and I'll talk about that when I talk about global change and stuff at the end. But right, you can have differences. You need to have those genetic differences and those in order to have resilience to changes in environment, right? And so one thing that scientists are currently trying to do in terms of conservation is they're trying to figure out what makes one species of coral more or less adaptable to changes in acidification, temperature, ocean temperatures, and things of that nature. And so our hope is to save these environments by incorporating biodiversity, by reintroducing coral that can actually deal with our changing disturbances in the way the planet is working. How? So that we can save that further biodiversity of those coral environments. And so, not only do we want biodiversity for those reasons, but right, we never know what can be helpful in the environment. We never know what chemical a plant produces or an insect produces, or in the case of penicillin, we don't know what a bacteria is producing and how it may be advantageous or helpful for us. And so keeping biodiversity is important to keep our planet generally functioning, to keep our ecosystems going, but also it helps us, right, to be selfish. If you really want to be selfish, we need biodiversity for ourselves. That's how we found penicillin. That's how we found all these other things. So that's all I have for you today on the role of disturbance. So next class will be a synthesis day. Look at it. We're going to be looking at community ecology. So please read that before you come in. The questions are up there. And so obviously we'll go over kind of this paper again of how bees and how bees interact and create biodiversity in their environments and how they're important in an ecosystem. Essentially, are bees a keystone species? Yes. And so, yeah. And then Friday we will have the quiz. All right. And I'll be here for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it will be on Friday?
Yes. Yes. The
It's
quiz
still
will be
going
on
to be the
Friday.
same opening and then closing at Saturday?
Yes. So it'll open Friday at 10. It'll close Saturday at 10. I'll give you the general 24 hours.
Can we take it after our discussion session?
Sorry?
Can we take it after the discussion session? So
yeah, sure.
Great. Thank you. Have a good day.
Any questions from the last two? No? All right. Wait. So stop sharing. I'll stop.